When you close your eyes and picture a caveman, what exactly comes to mind? If you are like most people, you probably imagine a hulking, hunched-over figure with a heavy brow ridge, dressed in a ragged, asymmetrical animal skin. He is probably clutching a massive wooden club, grunting in monosyllables, and, most importantly for our topic today, he is absolutely filthy. We tend to visualize our ancient ancestors as being permanently caked in a thick layer of mud, with greasy matted hair swarming with flies, carrying an odor so pungent it could probably knock out a modern human from 10 paces away. We think of the Stone Age as a time of unbridled squalor, a brutal, primitive era before the invention of running water, soap, and loofahs, where personal hygiene was simply not a concept that existed. It is a stereotype that has been heavily reinforced by decades of movies, cartoons, and pop culture caricatures. But how accurate is this dirty, smelly image? If we actually peel back the layers of time, dust off the fossil record, and look closely at the archaeological evidence, a completely different, totally fascinating picture begins to emerge. The story of ancient hygiene is not a story of ignorant beasts wallowing in their own filth. It is a story of incredible adaptation, deep biological instincts, and a profound, intimate connection with the natural world. Our ancestors were not just surviving, they were actively managing their bodies, their health, and their cleanliness in ways that might actually surprise you. Before we dive too deeply into the mud, the ash, and the surprising grooming habits of the Stone Age, I have a quick question for you, and I want you to drop a comment down below right now. What is the absolute longest you have ever gone without taking a shower or a bath? Was it a grueling 3-day camping trip in the woods? A week-long music festival where the wet wipes ran out on day 2? A long military deployment? Did you feel like you smelled worse than a Neanderthal by the end of it? Be brutally honest in the comments. I want to see who holds the record for the most authentic modern-day caveman experience. Now, let us travel back in time, hundreds of thousands of years ago, long before the first bars of soap were ever boiled down in ancient Babylon, and long before the Roman bathhouses became the pinnacle of cleanliness. To understand how early humans and our hominid cousins like the Neanderthals stayed clean, we first have to completely dismantle the idea that hygiene is an exclusively modern, civilized invention. Cleanliness is not just a cultural construct, it is a hardwired biological imperative. In the wild, being perpetually dirty, covered in decaying matter, or infested with parasites is not just an inconvenience, it is a swift death sentence. If an animal is too dirty, its wounds become infected. It becomes a beacon for blood-sucking insects that carry debilitating diseases, and its distinct pungent odor makes it incredibly easy for predators to track down. Survival in the unforgiving environment of the Pleistocene epoch demanded a baseline level of bodily maintenance. To see the roots of this, we do not even need to look at fossils. We can just look at our closest living relatives in the animal kingdom today. Chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas, and macaques all spend a massive, almost obsessive amount of their daily lives engaged in grooming. If you have ever watched a nature documentary, you have seen monkeys sitting in circles, meticulously picking through each other's fur. They are parting the hair, scanning the skin, and plucking out ticks, lice, fleas, and picking away flakes of dead skin and dried dirt. This is not just a casual hobby for them. It is a critical survival mechanism to keep parasite loads down. But it goes far deeper than just physical cleanliness. This act of mutual grooming is the absolute bedrock of their social structure. It is how they build alliances, make up after fights, and strengthen familial bonds. The physical sensation of being groomed triggers the release of endorphins and oxytocin, the __quote_0__ in the brain, lowering heart rates and reducing stress. Our early human ancestors inherited this exact same biological drive and social mechanism. Long before we had complex spoken language with vast vocabularies, we communicated trust and affection through touch. Grooming was the original social media. Imagine a group of early Homo sapiens or Neanderthals sitting around the glowing embers of a campfire after a long, exhausting day of foraging and hunting. They didn't have smartphones to stare at or books to read. Their evening entertainment and their social bonding consisted of sitting closely together, meticulously picking through each other's thick hair and skin, removing parasites, soothing aching muscles, and cleaning away the physical toll of the day. This communal grooming would have kept their bodies surprisingly free of major infestations and forged the deep, unshakable social bonds required to survive in a hostile world. They were taking care of each other, keeping each other clean in a very literal, hands-on way. But what about the dirt itself? Without hot showers and fragrant body washes, how did they wash away the literal sweat, blood, and grime of a Stone Age existence? The answer lies in their nomadic lifestyle and their absolute reliance on natural water sources. Early humans did not build permanent cities or sit in one place until the garbage piled up around them. They were hunter-gatherers, constantly on the move, following the migration patterns of animals and the seasonal blooming of edible plants. And where did these migration routes always lead? To water. Rivers, freshwater lakes, streams, and natural springs were the lifeblood of our ancestors. They camped near water, they drank from it, and naturally they entered it. Wading into a cold, rushing river wasn't just a way to cool down under the blistering prehistoric sun. It was the ultimate original bath. When you spend your days chasing down prey, butchering animals with flint tools, and digging in the earth for roots, you get covered in blood, fat, and dirt. If left on the skin, animal blood and fat would rot, attracting dangerous predators like saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, or massive bears who could smell a free meal from miles away. Washing off in a stream was a strict matter of self-preservation. The running water, combined with the natural friction of sand and gravel from the riverbed, provided an incredibly effective exfoliation process. Sand is a natural abrasive. Rubbing handfuls of river sand over their skin would easily scrub away dried blood, sticky tree sap, excess sebum, and caked-on mud, leaving the skin surprisingly clean and invigorated. And speaking of mud, this brings us to one of the most counterintuitive aspects of ancient hygiene. Sometimes, getting incredibly dirty was actually the best way to stay clean and healthy. While we view mud as the opposite of cleanliness, for a caveman, certain types of mud and clay were the equivalent of a high-end spa treatment and a medical necessity wrapped into one. In many indigenous cultures today, and evidently in our deep past, coating the body in a thick layer of wet clay or mud served multiple brilliant purposes. First and foremost, a layer of mud acts as a highly effective natural armor against the relentless onslaught of biting insects. Mosquitoes, biting flies, and gnats were not just annoying in the Pleistocene. They were vectors for terrible, life-threatening diseases. A thick, dried crust of mud on the skin made it physically impossible for these insects to bite through. Furthermore, as the mud baked and dried in the sun, it tightened on the skin. When it eventually flaked off or was scrubbed away in the river, it acted as a massive full-body pore strip. The dried clay would bind to dirt, dead skin cells, excess oils, and even tiny skin parasites. When the mud fell away, it took all of that grime with it, leaving the skin underneath completely refreshed. It was a natural, highly effective form of dry cleaning for the human body. Certain clays also have natural antibacterial and drawing properties, helping to pull toxins from minor wounds and soothe insect bites or poisonous plant rashes. So, if you saw a caveman covered head to toe in a grayish-brown crust, he wasn't necessarily unhygienic. He was actually employing a highly sophisticated, natural skincare routine to protect his health. Beyond standard mud, our ancestors discovered and utilized one of the most important minerals in human history: red ochre. This iron-rich clay pigment has been found at archaeological sites dating back hundreds of thousands of years, from the Blombos Cave in South Africa to Neanderthal settlements across Europe. We often associate red ochre with early human art, the stunning hand stencils and animal paintings on cave walls. But its primary everyday use was incredibly practical and intimately tied to bodily care. Red ochre was the ancient world's ultimate miracle cream. When ground into a fine powder and mixed with animal fat, bone marrow, or saliva, it created a thick red paste that was applied generously to the skin and hair. This red paste was an exceptionally good natural sunscreen, protecting our ancestors' skin from severe UV radiation during long days of hunting out on the open savanna or tundra. But its benefits didn't stop there. Ochre has scientifically proven antibacterial properties. Coating the body in this mixture would inhibit the growth of harmful bacteria on the skin, prevent infections in minor cuts and scrapes, and neutralize the bacteria that cause severe body odor. It also acted as an astringent, drying out weeping sores and repelling insects. So a Neanderthal or early human walking around stained a deep, vibrant crimson wasn't just making a fashion statement or engaging in a ritual. They were wearing a highly functional, antibacterial, sun-blocking, insect-repelling lotion that kept their skin healthy and drastically reduced their natural scent, which was crucial for sneaking up on prey. But what about their hair? This is where the modern imagination really runs wild. We picture enormous tangled birds' nests of hair crawling with lice and stiff with grease. Obviously, prehistoric humans did not have access to botanical shampoos, conditioners, or fine-toothed combs, and they certainly didn't have barbers. But human hair has its own incredible natural regulatory system that we have largely destroyed with modern chemical shampoos. When you wash your hair every single day with harsh detergents, you strip away the scalp's natural oils, sebum. Your scalp panics and goes into overdrive, producing even more oil to compensate, which is why your hair feels incredibly greasy if you skip just 1 or 2 days of washing. For a caveman whose scalp had never seen a drop of artificial detergent, the oil production was naturally balanced. The sebum coated the hair shafts, acting as a natural waterproof barrier that protected the head from cold rain and harsh winds. Yes, their hair would have been naturally oilier and heavier than ours, but it would not have been the dripping, foul-smelling mess we imagine. To manage the length and prevent it from becoming dangerously tangled in brush or grabbed by an enemy or predator, they utilized whatever tools they had. Sharp flint blades, which were easily capable of slicing through tough animal hides and meat, could easily be used to hack away excessively long or matted sections of hair. Moreover, they actively styled and protected their hair. That same mixture of red ochre and animal fat that they used on their skin was heavily worked into their hair. This thick, waxy coating essentially turned their hair into thick, heavy cords, highly reminiscent of modern-day dreadlocks or the Himba people of Namibia, who still use an ochre and fat mixture called odor to coat their skin and hair to this day. This ochre coating served a brilliant hygienic purpose. It created a hostile, suffocating environment for head lice and fleas. Parasites need access to the scalp to feed and lay eggs. A scalp and hair heavily packed with dense, mineral-rich clay and fat makes it incredibly difficult for lice to navigate, attach, or thrive. By essentially locking their hair into these thick, clay-bound strands, our ancestors were practicing highly effective preventative medicine against parasitic infestations. Let us transition from the hair and skin to something even more surprising: dental hygiene. If you look at the skeletal remains of early humans and Neanderthals, you might expect to see mouths full of rotten, decaying teeth or gums ravaged by disease. However, paleoanthropologists have made a startling discovery. The teeth of many ancient hunter-gatherers were actually in remarkably good condition, often significantly healthier with fewer cavities than the teeth of humans who lived thousands of years later during the agricultural revolution, or even humans living today. How is this possible without toothbrushes, fluoride paste, and modern dentistry? The primary answer lies in their diet. The modern epidemic of tooth decay is almost entirely fueled by refined sugars and heavily processed carbohydrates. Bacteria in our mouths feast on these sugars, producing harsh acids that eat away at our tooth enamel. The Stone Age diet, however, was practically devoid of these refined sugars. They ate lean meats, nuts, roots, tubers, seasonal berries, and leafy greens. This high-protein, high-fiber diet required intense, prolonged chewing. The very act of chewing tough, fibrous plants and meats stimulated massive saliva production, which naturally washed away food particles and neutralized mouth acids. The fibrous foods themselves acted as natural scrubbers, mechanically wiping the surfaces of the teeth clean with every bite. But they didn't just rely on their diet. There is concrete physical evidence that early humans actively cleaned their teeth. When scientists examined Neanderthal teeth under high-powered electron microscopes, they frequently find distinct, repetitive grooves and scratches on the sides of the teeth, right near the gum line. These grooves are exactly what you would expect to see if someone was habitually using a tool to pick between their teeth. They were using toothpicks. Small stiff pieces of grass, bone fragments, or sharp wooden splinters were regularly used to dig out annoying pieces of meat or sinew trapped between their molars. They found food stuck in their teeth just as irritating as we do today, and they took active mechanical steps to remove it. Even more incredibly, they had their own prehistoric equivalent of chewing gum, which served both as a tool-making material and a primitive breath mint and tooth cleaner. Across various archaeological sites in Europe, researchers have found small hardened lumps of birch bark pitch with distinctly human tooth marks imprinted perfectly in them. Birch pitch is a sticky, dark substance made by slowly heating birch bark in a low-oxygen environment, a highly complex chemical process that proves Neanderthals and early humans were incredibly intelligent. They primarily used this pitch as a superglue to attach stone spearheads to wooden shafts. But as it cooled, it became hard and brittle. To make it pliable enough to use, they had to chew it. However, they chewed it far more often than was strictly necessary for tool making. Birch bark contains a compound called betulin, which is a powerful natural antiseptic and antibacterial agent. Chewing this pitch would have effectively killed the harmful bacteria in their mouths, drastically reducing bad breath and preventing gum infections. It also acted as a sticky trap, pulling debris and plaque off the surfaces of their teeth as they chewed. In one famous case, geneticists managed to sequence the DNA from a piece of chewed birch pitch found in Denmark, which was over 5,000 years old. Not only did they identify the gender and physical traits of the girl who chewed it, but they also found traces of the hazelnut and duck she had eaten beforehand, and the specific mouth bacteria she harbored. This ancient chewing gum was a multi-purpose hygienic tool, soothing toothaches, cleaning teeth, and freshening breath with its distinct, piney, campfire-like taste. The fascinating ingenuity of ancient chewing gum and natural toothpicks naturally brings us to the other end of the human digestive process. It is the topic no one really wants to think about when romanticizing the past, but it is absolutely essential to understanding ancient hygiene. How did early humans handle bodily waste? If you place a large group of people in one spot for too long without modern plumbing, disease and squalor are the inevitable results. Throughout the Middle Ages, crowded European cities became nightmarish cesspools of cholera and dysentery, precisely because they failed to properly manage human waste. Yet our Stone Age ancestors managed to avoid these catastrophic localized plagues. Their secret was surprisingly simple, heavily reliant on their environment and deeply rooted in a natural instinct for spatial organization. For the vast majority of human history, we were entirely nomadic. This nomadic lifestyle was, in itself, the ultimate hygienic strategy. When a hunter-gatherer tribe needed to relieve themselves, they simply walked away from the immediate camp, found a discreet spot behind a bush or a rock, and let nature take its course. Because the population density of the Paleolithic world was incredibly low, and because these groups were constantly packing up and moving to follow seasonal game, waste never had the opportunity to accumulate to toxic levels. The environment easily absorbed and decomposed the organic matter. Beetles, flies, bacteria, and scavengers quickly broke it down, returning the nutrients to the soil. By the time a tribe might return to that same camping spot a year later, the area was completely clean and overgrown with fresh vegetation. They literally walked away from their sanitation problems. But what happened during the harsh, bitter winters of the Ice Age, when moving wasn't an option and tribes were forced to shelter deep inside caves for months on end? This is where the stereotype of the quote _one completely falls apart under archaeological scrutiny. When paleoanthropologists excavate ancient cave dwellings, they do not find a chaotic, haphazard mess where people slept, ate, and defecated in the exact same spot. Instead, they find clear, deliberate, and highly organized living spaces. Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens mentally divided their caves into distinct, quote, two or zones, demonstrating a profound understanding of cross-contamination long before the discovery of germ theory. The deepest, most protected parts of the cave were strictly reserved for sleeping. The center of the main cavern was almost always dedicated to the massive communal hearth, the source of heat, light, and cooking. Butchery of large animals, which was a bloody, messy, and foul-smelling process, was strictly relegated to the outer edges of the cave, or just outside the entrance. And the waste? They established designated quote three, which were essentially ancient trash heaps and latrines, located far away from the sleeping and cooking areas, often outside the cave entirely or in deep, unused offshoot tunnels where the smell and insects wouldn't bother them. They actively swept the floors of their main living areas, clearing away bone fragments, decaying plant matter, and debris. They were not wallowing in filth. They were actively managing their interior design for optimal health and comfort. Perhaps one of the most brilliant and completely accidental discoveries in the history of human hygiene came straight from the center of those carefully organized caves, the campfire. We think of fire merely as a tool for cooking meat and warding off the freezing cold. But the byproduct of those fires, the fine white wood ash left behind, was a multi-purpose chemical powerhouse. Wood ash is highly alkaline. When a prehistoric hunter returned to the cave after butchering a massive woolly rhinoceros, his hands and forearms would be coated in a thick, sticky, incredibly stubborn layer of animal fat and drying blood. Simply rinsing his hands in cold river water would do absolutely nothing to remove the grease. Water and oil simply do not mix. However, if that hunter reached into the cold remnants of yesterday's fire, grabbed a handful of white wood ash, and rubbed it vigorously into his greasy, wet hands, a remarkable chemical reaction would take place right there on his skin. When alkaline wood ash mixes with water and animal fat, it undergoes a chemical process called saponification. Without even realizing the complex chemistry involved, our ancestors were essentially creating the world's very first soap directly on their bodies. The abrasive texture of the ash acted as an incredibly effective scouring powder, scrubbing away dirt and dried blood, while the rudimentary lye and fat mixture broke down the stubborn grease, allowing it to be effortlessly rinsed away in the nearest stream. White ash was the original heavy-duty mechanic soap of the Paleolithic era. The hygienic power of the hearth didn't stop at the ash. The smoke generated by these fires was an equally vital tool for personal cleanliness and pest control. If you have ever sat around a smoky campfire, you know that the smell aggressively clings to your hair and your clothes. For early humans, this wasn't an annoyance. It was a highly desired outcome. Smoke bathing is a practice still utilized by many indigenous cultures around the world today, and it was a daily reality for cave dwellers. Standing in the thick, pungent smoke of a smoldering fire of green wood or specific aromatic herbs served a dual purpose. First, the intense smoke acted as a powerful fumigant. It irritated, suffocated, and drove away the lice, ticks, and fleas that naturally tried to make a home in human hair and animal skin clothing. If a hide blanket became infested, it wasn't washed in a washing machine. It was hung directly over a smoky fire until the parasites either fled or died. Second, smoke is highly antimicrobial. The chemical compounds in wood smoke, such as phenols and formaldehyde, naturally inhibit the growth of bacteria and fungi. By regularly impregnating their hair, skin, and animal hide clothing with thick wood smoke, early humans were effectively neutralizing the bacteria that cause severe body odor and preventing fungal infections like ringworm or athlete's foot. They may have smelled like a walking, talking barbecue, but in the wild, smelling like pungent wood smoke is infinitely preferable to smelling like decaying sweat and dirt, which attracts both flies and apex predators. This deep reliance on the natural world to solve complex hygienic problems extended far beyond ash and smoke. When we think about cleanliness, we must also consider the management of bodily fluids, specifically regarding menstruation, childbirth, and severe wounds. Without cotton bandages, modern tampons, or sterile gauze, how did prehistoric women manage their periods? And how did hunters stop the bleeding from a nasty gash caused by a flint slip or a struggling animal? The answer lies in one of the most extraordinary and overlooked plants in the natural world, sphagnum moss. Sphagnum moss, commonly known as peat moss, grows in damp, boggy environments across the globe. To the untrained eye, it is just a patch of green fuzz on the forest floor. But to our ancestors, it was an absolutely critical medical and hygienic resource. The cellular structure of sphagnum moss is a marvel of natural engineering. It consists of large, hollow, barrel-shaped cells that can absorb and hold a staggering amount of liquid, often up to 20 times its own dry weight. It is naturally softer than cotton, incredibly pliable, and easy to harvest in massive quantities. But its absorbency is only half of the magic. Sphagnum moss is naturally highly acidic and contains a complex cocktail of specialized chemical compounds that are fiercely antimicrobial and antibacterial. It is effectively a naturally occurring, pre-sterilized sponge. Early women almost certainly gathered and dried large quantities of this moss to use as highly effective absorbent pads during their menstrual cycles. It was clean, it neutralized odors due to its acidity, and it prevented the bacterial infections that could easily arise from using less sanitary materials. When a hunter suffered a deep wound, a clump of fresh or dried sphagnum moss was immediately pressed into the laceration and bound tightly with strips of hide. The moss would rapidly absorb the blood, promoting clotting, while its natural iodine and acidic properties would actively fight off the bacteria attempting to colonize the open flesh, staving off gangrene and sepsis. It was the absolute perfect prehistoric bandage. The effectiveness of this natural medical hygiene was so profound that thousands of years later, during the brutal trench warfare of World War I, British and German medics frantically harvested thousands of tons of sphagnum moss to pack the wounds of bleeding soldiers when they completely ran out of standard cotton bandages, saving countless lives from infection. Our ancient ancestors had figured out this life-saving trick hundreds of thousands of years prior. The medical hygiene of early humans extended to an intimate knowledge of local botany. They were not just randomly grabbing leaves, they were actively self-medicating and managing their internal and oral hygiene with specific, targeted plants. We know this because scientists have meticulously scraped the hardened dental plaque, the tartar or calculus, of the teeth of ancient Neanderthal skulls and analyzed the microscopic plant matter trapped inside. The results are nothing short of astounding. In the calculus of a Neanderthal found in El Zidrón cave in Spain, researchers discovered the microscopic traces of poplar tree bark and chamomile. Poplar bark is nature's pharmacy. It is incredibly rich in salicylic acid, which is the exact active chemical ingredient found in modern-day aspirin. Chamomile is a well-known natural anti-inflammatory and soothing agent. What makes this discovery absolutely incredible is that the specific Neanderthal whose teeth contained these plants had a massive, agonizing dental abscess, a severe infection in his jaw. He wasn't just eating these bitter plants for calories, he was deliberately chewing them to self-administer painkillers and reduce the swelling in his infected gums. He was practicing highly specific medical hygiene to treat a localized infection. Even more remarkably, traces of penicillium, the naturally occurring fungus from which we derive the antibiotic penicillin, were also found in this same individual's teeth. While we cannot say for certain if he intentionally ingested the mold to cure his infection, or if it was an accidental byproduct of eating moldy vegetation, it proves that the prehistoric diet naturally introduced powerful, life-saving antimicrobial agents into their bodies, helping to keep massive infections at bay. This brings us to a crucial paradigm shift in how we understand the very concept of being clean. Today, in our modern industrialized society, we equate cleanliness with absolute sterility. We use bleach to wipe down our counters, antibacterial soaps to scrub our hands, and alcohol-based sanitizers to annihilate every microscopic organism we come into contact with. We view all bacteria as the enemy, a sign of dirt and danger. But biological science is rapidly discovering that this obsessive, scorched earth approach to hygiene might actually be doing us more harm than good, and that the dirty cavemen might have actually possessed a superior, far more resilient biological defense system. This concept is known among immunologists and evolutionary biologists as the old friends hypothesis. For millions of years, human beings evolved in deep, constant, unavoidable contact with the soil, untreated water, animals, and the vast, invisible world of microbes. Because our ancestors were constantly exposed to this staggering diversity of bacteria, fungi, and natural environmental elements, their immune systems were incredibly robust, well-trained, and kept in a state of perfect balance. The human body is not a sterile fortress. It is a bustling, incredibly complex ecosystem. You have trillions of bacteria living right now on the surface of your skin, in your mouth, and deep inside your gut. This is your microbiome. When we look at isolated, modern-day hunter-gatherer tribes in the Amazon rainforest or the African savanna, people who live a lifestyle remarkably similar to our Stone Age ancestors, we find that their microbiomes are radically different from ours. They possess a staggering diversity of skin and gut bacteria that have gone completely extinct in the modern, urbanized human population. For a prehistoric caveman, this thick, diverse, invisible layer of friendly bacteria living on their skin was the ultimate invisible suit of armor. Because they weren't stripping their skin of its natural oils and resident microbes every single day with harsh chemical soaps, their skin was heavily populated by benign commensal bacteria. These _quote_6_ microbes acted as a living, breathing shield. They occupied all the available real estate on the skin surface and consumed all the available microscopic resources. If a highly dangerous pathogenic bacteria, like a deadly strain of staph or a flesh-eating microbe, landed on a caveman's arm, it would find it incredibly difficult to gain a foothold. The friendly bacteria would aggressively outcompete the dangerous invaders, starving them out and neutralizing the threat before it could cause an infection. By our modern, heavily sterilized standards, a Neanderthal or an early Homo sapiens would undoubtedly fail a white glove inspection. Their feet would be calloused and stained with earth, their hands deeply etched with plant resins and animal fat, and their skin would carry the distinct, heavy musk of wood smoke, crushed herbs, and human sweat. But from a purely biological and evolutionary standpoint, they were perfectly, optimally Growth 7 for the exact environment they inhabited. They possessed a rugged, deeply natural state of hygiene that allowed them to thrive in a world filled with microscopic dangers, relying on the chemistry of ash, the absorbency of moss, the protective barrier of natural oils, and a symbiotic army of invisible bacteria to protect them from the harsh realities of the wild. They were not ignorant beasts wallowing in the mud. They were masters of their environment, deeply attuned to the natural tools of survival and cleanliness. This protective, invisible layer of bacteria on the skin was absolutely essential, especially when we consider what these early humans were actually wearing. This brings us to a fascinating and often entirely misunderstood chapter in the story of ancient hygiene: prehistoric laundry. We just discussed how they managed their skin and their hair, but what happened when they wrapped themselves in the skins of the animals they hunted? If you have ever been near a raw, untreated animal hide, you know that it is not something you would ever want touching your bare skin. An untreated skin is essentially raw meat. Within hours of an animal dying, the hide begins to rapidly decompose. It becomes slick, it putrefies, it emits a horrific stomach-churning stench of rotting flesh, and it immediately becomes a breeding ground for maggots, dangerous bacteria, and disease-carrying flies. Wearing a raw, rotting hide would be a hygienic nightmare, practically guaranteeing severe skin infections and a rapid death from sepsis if the wearer had even a single open scratch on their body. So, how did our ancestors transform these rotting animal skins into the safe, durable, warm, and highly functional clothing that allowed them to survive the bitter, freezing extremes of the Ice Age? They performed one of the earliest and most complex chemical engineering feats in human history: tanning. Long before the invention of synthetic fabrics, washing machines, or dry cleaners, early humans discovered how to completely halt the biological decay of animal tissue. The process of ancient tanning was incredibly labor-intensive. Undeniably gruesome by modern standards, but absolutely crucial for personal hygiene and survival. First, the fresh hide had to be painstakingly scraped clean of every single trace of fat, meat, and connective tissue using sharp flint or bone tools. If even a tiny scrap of fat was left behind, it would eventually go rancid and rot the leather from the inside out. Once the hide was completely scraped, it was stiff, rigid, and totally unwearable. To make it soft and pliable, they utilized a bizarre but incredibly effective chemical solution provided right there by the animal they had just hunted: its brain. There is an old, profound saying among indigenous tanners that quote, ate and ancient humans knew this intimately. Animal brains are incredibly rich in emulsified oils and lipids. The hunters would boil or mash the animal's brain into a thick, fatty slurry and violently rub it deep into the pores of the scraped hide. This brain paste actively bonded with the protein fibers of the skin, softening them and preventing them from locking together into a hard, rigid board as they dried. But brain tanning was only one part of the hygienic clothing process. To truly waterproof the leather and make it impervious to bacterial rot and parasitic infestation, they subjected the clothing to the same powerful tool they used on their own bodies: heavy, dense wood smoke. After the hides were softened, they were hung inside specialized smoking tents or directly over smoldering, smoky fires for days at a time. The formaldehyde, creosote, and complex tars naturally present in wood smoke deeply penetrated the leather fibers. This process fundamentally changed the chemistry of the hide. A heavily smoked leather garment is practically indestructible. It will not rot even if it gets soaking wet. It fiercely repels water. And most importantly for ancient hygiene, the pungent, sharp smell of the smoke makes the garment incredibly hostile to body lice, ticks, and fleas. Their clothes didn't smell like modern laundry detergent. They smelled like a powerful, deeply cured campfire, which was the ultimate prehistoric pest repellent. Speaking of pests, the clothing of our ancestors actually holds a massive hidden secret about the timeline of human hygiene, locked away within the DNA of one of our most annoying evolutionary companions, the louse. Here is where the story of ancient hygiene becomes a literal biological detective thriller. Scientists who study the evolution of parasites have made a brilliant discovery regarding human lice. There are two primary types of lice that infest humans: head lice, which live exclusively on the scalp and cling to the round shafts of human hair, and body lice, which are entirely distinct. Body lice do not live on the skin. They have evolved specifically to live, hide, and lay their eggs entirely within the woven fibers and seams of human clothing, only venturing onto the skin momentarily to feed on blood. Because body lice physically cannot exist without clothing to live in, evolutionary geneticists realized that by sequencing the DNA of modern head lice and modern body lice, they could calculate exactly when the two species genetically diverged from a common ancestor. The results were completely groundbreaking. The DNA molecular clock revealed that body lice evolved from head lice roughly 170,000 years ago. This gave anthropologists a precise, undeniable timestamp for exactly when human beings stopped walking around completely naked and started constantly, habitually wearing tailored animal skin clothing. The fact that an entirely new species of parasite rapidly evolved just to exploit this new environmental niche, our clothes, shows that dealing with pests was a constant, grueling arms race. It proves that early humans were wearing clothes regularly enough for a parasite to permanently move in, which makes their practices of smoke bathing and utilizing ash even more critical. They were constantly fighting a microscopic war within the very garments that kept them alive. While they were wrapped in deeply smoked, brain-tanned leathers to survive the freezing winds, there was one part of their body that frequently remained completely exposed to the harsh elements: their feet. When we think of human feet today, we think of soft, delicate skin trapped inside tightly laced shoes and thick cotton socks for 10 to 14 hours a day. Modern footwear, while comfortable, is actually a massive breeding ground for poor hygiene. A dark, warm, incredibly sweaty shoe is the absolute perfect incubator for fungal infections like athlete's foot, severe bacterial overgrowth, and terrible odors. We have engineered our own foot hygiene problems by enclosing them. For the vast majority of our history, humans walked completely barefoot across jagged rocks, burning sands, dense forests, and freezing tundra. Even when simple, wrap-around leather moccasins were invented, they were thin, loose, and highly breathable. How did they keep their feet from becoming infected, injured, or diseased while constantly walking through dirt, mud, and animal droppings? The answer is that the human foot is a marvel of biological adaptation. When a human walks barefoot constantly from birth, the skin on the soles of the feet undergoes a radical physical transformation. It thickens dramatically, forming deep, tough, highly elastic calluses that are functionally equivalent to the thick rubber soles of modern hiking boots. This thick layer of dead, highly keratinized skin was their ultimate hygienic barrier. It was practically impenetrable to thorns, sharp flints, and biting ground insects. Furthermore, because their feet were constantly exposed to the open air and sunlight, sweat evaporated instantly. A dry foot is a healthy foot. Fungi and harmful bacteria absolutely require chronic moisture and darkness to multiply and cause infections. By walking barefoot or in highly breathable, unrestrictive leather wrappings, our ancestors completely eliminated the environmental conditions required for modern foot diseases to take hold. Their feet may have been visually stained with the dust of the earth, heavily calloused and rugged, but from a purely medical perspective, they were profoundly healthy, resilient, and virtually immune to the rot and fungal plagues that plague modern shoe-wearing populations. They relied on the immense natural defensive capabilities of their own biology rather than artificially encasing themselves. This reliance on biological adaptation and harsh environmental reality brings us to the very core of human survival, the hygiene of what they put inside their bodies. How on earth did early humans avoid catastrophic food poisoning? Today, if you leave a package of raw chicken on the kitchen counter at room temperature for an afternoon, it becomes a toxic biological weapon capable of sending you to the emergency room with severe salmonella or E. coli poisoning. We rely entirely on the artificial cold of refrigerators and the blazing heat of modern ovens to keep our food safe to consume. Early hunter-gatherers had none of these luxuries. When a group of Neanderthals or early Homo sapiens successfully hunted and brought down a massive 3-ton woolly mammoth, they had an immediate, colossal hygienic crisis on their hands. They suddenly possessed thousands of pounds of highly nutritious raw meat sitting out in the open air, and the clock of decomposition began ticking the very second the animal's heart stopped beating. How did they process and consume this meat without dying from the massive blooms of necrotic bacteria that immediately set in? The first line of defense was sheer speed and communal effort. Butchering a massive animal was an all-hands-on-deck, frantic operation. The tribe worked quickly with razor-sharp stone tools to strip the meat from the bones before the deep internal organs began to putrefy and taint the surrounding muscle tissue. During the depths of the Ice Age, the freezing environment itself acted as a massive natural walk-in freezer, preserving the meat for long periods. But what about during the warmer summer months, or for tribes living in the blistering heat of the African savanna? This is where our ancestors mastered the ancient art of food preservation, a hygienic practice that kept them alive through periods of drought and famine. They understood intuitively that bacteria require water to survive and multiply. By slicing the meat into incredibly thin strips and hanging it high up in the branches of trees, exposed to the blazing sun and dry winds, they rapidly evaporated the moisture right out of the flesh. They were inventing jerky. Once the meat was completely desiccated and hard as wood, it was functionally immortal. The bacteria literally died of thirst, and the meat could be carried for months without spoiling. They also heavily utilized the same smoking process they used on their clothes. Hanging meat over a smoky fire not only dried it out, but impregnated it with those powerful antimicrobial chemical compounds from the wood smoke, effectively sealing the meat against bacterial rot and keeping flies from laying eggs on it. Yet there were times when meat inevitably began to turn. Before a successful hunt, a starving tribe might be forced to scavenge a carcass abandoned by lions or wolves. A carcass that had been sitting in the sun for a day or two and was already starting to smell slightly sweet and foul. Consuming this meat should mathematically have killed them. But human biology holds another astonishing, hidden hygienic weapon. We rarely think about it, but the human stomach is an incredibly hostile, brutally acidic environment. When biologists compare the pH levels, the measure of acidity, of the stomachs of various mammals, a fascinating pattern emerges. Herbivores like cows or sheep have relatively neutral stomachs designed to slowly ferment grass. Carnivores like lions have highly acidic stomachs to break down raw meat. But human stomach acid is exceptionally, incredibly strong, registering at a pH level between 1.5 and 2.0. This level of severe acidity is significantly stronger than a typical carnivore's stomach. In fact, human stomach acid is biologically on par with the stomach acid of dedicated scavengers like vultures and hyenas. Animals that have evolved specifically to eat rotting, disease-ridden meat without dying. Evolutionary biologists believe that during our early evolutionary history, before we mastered hunting large game, our ancestors went through a prolonged scavenging phase, relying heavily on the bone marrow and leftover meat of animals killed by other predators. To survive eating this potentially tainted, bacteria-laden meat, our bodies evolved an intensely powerful internal chemical defense system. Our incredibly acidic stomachs act as a merciless internal sterilization chamber. When an early human consumed a piece of meat that was slightly past its prime, carrying a heavy load of dangerous pathogens, that bacteria was plunged directly into a bath of potent hydrochloric acid. The vast majority of the dangerous microbes were instantly incinerated by the stomach acid before they ever had a chance to reach the delicate intestines and cause a systemic infection. So a critical part of ancient human hygiene wasn't just external cleanliness, it was an extraordinarily powerful, highly evolved internal digestive furnace designed to annihilate foodborne illnesses. Of course, surviving food is only half the battle. You can survive for weeks without eating, but you will die in a matter of days without water. Sourcing clean, safe drinking water is perhaps the single most critical hygienic challenge any living organism faces. Stagnant water is nature's most effective poison. A warm, still puddle or a shallow, non-moving pond is a massive, thriving metropolis for dysentery, cholera, giardia, liver flukes, and millions of mosquito larvae. If an early human simply knelt and drank deeply from the first muddy puddle they found, their lifespan would be incredibly short. They possessed a deep, instinctual, and geographically brilliant understanding of hydrology to keep themselves safe. First, they universally prioritized rapidly moving water. A fast-flowing river or a bubbling stream is naturally aerated, and a constant physical movement of the water makes it incredibly difficult for massive bacterial colonies or algae blooms to establish themselves. But they went far beyond just finding a river. When traveling through arid environments, they knew how to read the landscape to find the safest water possible. They would follow the distinct, well-worn trails of animals, not just to hunt them, but because animals possess a deep, instinctual knowledge of hidden, natural springs where groundwater pushes up fresh, filtered, and crystal clear from deep within the bedrock. Even more ingeniously, when faced with a murky, stagnant water source or a muddy, drying riverbed, our ancestors knew how to utilize the earth itself as a massive, natural water filter. Instead of drinking directly from a muddy pool, archaeological evidence shows that early humans would step back a few feet from the water's edge and dig a deep hole directly into the sandy bank. As they waited, water from the murky pond would slowly seep through the dense layers of sand and gravel, eventually filling the hole they had just dug. The sand acted as a brilliant, highly effective mechanical filter, trapping sediment, massive algae, and even many types of large parasites and bacterial clusters, leaving the water in the newly dug hole significantly clearer and drastically safer to consume than the water just a few feet away. They were utilizing complex, multi-stage water filtration thousands of years before the invention of plumbing or modern water treatment plants. They understood that the earth could clean water if they just knew how to manipulate it. This complex understanding of the environment and biology naturally influenced how they handled the most vulnerable members of their society, the sick and the elderly. When we picture the harsh, brutal reality of the Stone Age, it is easy to assume a survival of the fittest mentality, where anyone who became severely injured, ill, or too old to hunt was simply abandoned to the wolves. However, the fossil record tells a deeply moving, profoundly different story, one that highlights a sophisticated level of communal care and medical hygiene. In a cave in Shanida, Iraq, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Neanderthal man known as Shanida I. When they examined his skeleton, they found evidence of massive, catastrophic trauma. He had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his head, crushing his eye socket and likely leaving him completely blind in that eye. His right arm had been amputated or withered away entirely above the elbow, and he had severe, crippling arthritis in his right leg, meaning he walked with a painful, pronounced limp. In the wild, an individual with these immense physical disabilities would be completely unable to hunt, forage, or defend himself. By all ruthless laws of nature, he should have died quickly. But Shanida I didn't die from his injuries. His bones showed that these massive wounds had completely healed, and he lived for many, many years after sustaining them, surviving well into his 40s or 50s, an incredibly old age for a Neanderthal. This means only one thing: his tribe did not abandon him. They actively cared for him. They must have painstakingly cleaned his horrific wounds, likely using the sphagnum moss and herbal remedies we discussed earlier, preventing the massive infections that should have killed him. They pre-chewed his food if his jaw was injured, they kept him warm, and they physically supported him when the tribe moved. This profound empathy and communal hygiene, the act of a society pooling its resources and knowledge to keep a severely vulnerable, non-contributing member clean, safe, and alive, is perhaps the greatest testament to the deeply human spirit of our ancestors. It proves that hygiene and medicine were not just individual pursuits. They were a deeply ingrained, compassionate social safety net. This deep communal empathy brings us to the ultimate turning point in the epic story of human hygiene. If our Stone Age ancestors were so brilliantly adapted to their environment, if they possessed natural soap, antibacterial clothing, robust microbiomes, and powerful internal defenses, what exactly happened? Why do we have this persistent, unshakable cultural memory of the past being a filthy, disease-ridden nightmare? The answer lies in the single most catastrophic event in the history of human health and hygiene. A massive, global shift that fundamentally broke the perfect biological balance our ancestors had spent millions of years perfecting. We call it the agricultural revolution. Roughly 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, as the last ice age receded and the global climate stabilized, humanity made a monumental decision. Instead of endlessly wandering the landscape, following herds and gathering wild plants, we decided to stop walking. We learned how to plant seeds, harvest crops, and build permanent fences. We built the very first villages, which grew into towns, which eventually exploded into massive, sprawling cities. We traded our dynamic, nomadic existence for a stationary, sedentary lifestyle. From a purely technological and cultural standpoint, agriculture was a massive leap forward. It allowed for written language, complex mathematics, permanent architecture, and the birth of modern civilization as we know it. But from a biological and hygienic standpoint, the agricultural revolution was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. When you stop moving, your waste stops moving with you. Remember how the hunter-gatherers simply walked away from their sanitation problems, allowing the vast natural environment to safely absorb and decompose human waste? When humans began living in densely packed, permanent settlements of hundreds or thousands of people, that strategy instantly collapsed. They were suddenly forced to eat, sleep, and live directly on top of generations of their own accumulated garbage and excrement. The dawn of the cesspool. Without the invention of modern plumbing, early agricultural settlements rapidly became highly toxic biological dead zones. The earth could no longer absorb the sheer, concentrated volume of waste. Local water sources, the nearby rivers and streams that had once provided pristine, filtered drinking water, quickly became heavily contaminated with human and animal feces. When you drink water contaminated with human waste, you are instantly exposed to a horrific array of devastating waterborne pathogens. This is exactly when catastrophic, localized epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and severe fatal dysentery first exploded into the human population. These diseases are virtually non-existent in small, highly mobile nomadic tribes because the chain of infection is constantly broken. But in a crowded farming village, a single contaminated well could wipe out half the population in a matter of weeks. The quote 10 that we so vividly imagine does not belong to the caveman. It belongs to the early farmer. We literally built our own disease incubators. Furthermore, agriculture fundamentally changed our physical relationship with the animal kingdom, unleashing a microscopic horror show that still haunts humanity today. Hunter-gatherers hunted wild animals, killed them, and ate them. They did not live with them. But the agricultural revolution brought the invention of domestication. Early farmers began capturing wild aurochs, boars, and wolves, breeding them over generations to create domestic cows, pigs, and dogs. For the first time in human history, we began living shoulder to shoulder with massive herds of livestock. We slept in the same barns, breathed the same enclosed air, and constantly handled their manure to fertilize our newly planted crops. This unprecedented, unnatural physical intimacy with animals created the perfect biological bridge for zoonotic diseases, viruses and bacteria that naturally exist in animals but mutate to infect humans. Almost every major civilization-ending plague in human history can be directly traced back to the domestication of animals during the agricultural revolution. Measles mutated from a disease called rinderpest, which infects cattle. When we domesticated cows and lived closely with them, the virus jumped the species barrier and became a human nightmare. Smallpox, the deadliest pathogen in human history, responsible for hundreds of millions of deaths, likely evolved from a pox virus found in camels or cattle. Influenza. The flu naturally circulates in wild waterfowl, but by domesticating pigs and chickens and keeping them closely packed together on farms, we created massive, mutating viral mixing bowls. Tuberculosis, also heavily linked to early cattle domestication, spreading rapidly through the crowded, poorly ventilated mud brick homes of early settlements. Our Stone Age ancestors never had to face these terrifying, highly contagious plagues. Their isolated nomadic groups acted as natural firebreaks against viral spread. If a hunter contracted a rare disease from a wild animal, the disease might tragically wipe out his immediate family unit of 20 people, but it would completely burn itself out and stop there. In a connected agricultural society with trade routes and crowded cities, that same disease could spread like wildfire, devastating entire continents. The collapse of the human body. If the infectious diseases weren't enough, the shift to agriculture profoundly and devastatingly altered the very physical structure of the human body, leaving undeniable tragic evidence in the fossil record. When paleoanthropologists compare the skeletons of late hunter-gatherers to the skeletons of the early farmers who lived just a few thousand years later, the contrast is absolutely shocking. The hunter-gatherers were generally tall, heavily muscled, and possessed incredibly dense, robust bones built by a lifetime of diverse physical activity and a rich, highly varied diet of dozens of different plant and animal species. The early farmers, by contrast, show massive signs of chronic, severe malnutrition. Their average height plummeted dramatically. Their bones became significantly thinner, weaker, and riddled with distinct telltale lesions called porotic hyperostosis, spongy, porous bone growth on the skull and eye sockets that is a direct, screaming indicator of chronic anemia, severe vitamin deficiencies, and massive parasitic infections. How could people who successfully invented farming be starving? It comes down to a lack of biodiversity. A hunter-gatherer might eat 60 different types of roots, berries, nuts, and meats over the course of a year, guaranteeing a complete profile of vital micronutrients, vitamins, and minerals. Early farmers, however, placed all of their biological bets on just one or two massive staple crops, usually wheat, barley, rice, or corn. While these grains provide a massive amount of cheap, easily storable calories to fuel a booming population, they are nutritionally incredibly poor. Surviving entirely on a monocrop diet of wheat porridge is a recipe for severe malnourishment. This drastic dietary shift completely destroyed the pristine dental hygiene of the Stone Age. We discussed earlier how Neanderthals and early humans had remarkably healthy teeth because they consumed almost no refined carbohydrates. The introduction of mass agriculture flooded the human mouth with exactly what the destructive bacteria crave: heavy, sticky, fermentable carbohydrates. Wheat, barley, and corn break down rapidly into simple sugars right inside the mouth. When you look at the skulls of early agriculturalists, their mouths are horrific landscapes of pain and decay. Massive, deep cavities become incredibly common. Rampant gum disease led to extreme, agonizing tooth loss at very young ages. Abscesses, which can easily become fatal if the infection reaches the brain, skyrocketed. Because they were grinding their grain on heavy stone querns, tiny fragments of the rock constantly chipped off into the flour. Every bite of their daily bread was essentially laced with sand, which acted like heavy-duty sandpaper, aggressively grinding their tooth enamel down to the raw, incredibly sensitive nerves. The invention of bread was a total catastrophe for human dental hygiene. By stepping out of the wild and building our own artificial, sedentary environments, we effectively traded our robust, natural, evolutionary health for the sheer caloric security of farming. We abandoned the highly functional protective muds, the antimicrobial wood smoke, the natural botanical medicines, and the incredible spatial organization of the nomadic life. We clustered tightly together in our own waste, fed ourselves a nutritionally bankrupt diet of pure carbohydrates, and invited the diseases of the animal kingdom directly into our living rooms. We became shorter, sicker, deeply malnourished, and plagued by terrible dental decay. We spent the next 10,000 years desperately trying to invent artificial technologies: sewers, aqueducts, vaccinations, antibiotics, and chemical soaps, just to try and reclaim the baseline level of health and hygiene that our Stone Age ancestors had naturally enjoyed for free. Rethinking the dirty caveman. So, where does this incredibly long, complex journey through the mud, the ash, the smoke, and the bones leave us? It demands a total, fundamental rewrite of the historical narrative we have been taught. The image of the bumbling, perpetually filthy caveman scratching his lice-ridden head and wallowing in his own squalor is not just mildly inaccurate, it is a profound insult to the sheer brilliance, adaptability, and resilience of the human species. Hygiene is not an invention of modern civilization. It is a primal, biological imperative that we have continuously practiced, evolved, and perfected since the very dawn of our existence. Our ancestors were absolute masters of their microscopic and physical environments. They were the first chemists, harnessing the highly specific, complex saponification of alkaline wood ash and animal fat to scrub away stubborn grime, long before the word chemistry existed. They were the first botanists and medics, instinctively utilizing the acidic, intensely antimicrobial properties of sphagnum moss to dress massive, life-threatening wounds and self-medicating their painful dental abscesses with the natural aspirin found in poplar bark. They were the first chemical engineers, utilizing the complex properties of boiling animal brains and the heavy preservative tars of dense wood smoke to halt the biological decay of animal skins, creating impenetrable parasite-repellent clothing. They were the first dentists, mechanically scrubbing their teeth with tough fibrous diets, utilizing specialized natural toothpicks, and chewing incredibly complex antibacterial birch bark pitch to kill the germs in their mouths. They were deeply, profoundly compassionate, risking their own survival to physically clean, heal, and endlessly care for the shattered, crippled, and blind members of their tribe, proving that hygiene was a collective, empathetic endeavor. Most importantly, they lived in a state of absolute, perfect biological harmony with the microscopic world. They didn't view nature as a sterile, terrifying enemy to be relentlessly sanitized and destroyed with bleach and alcohol. They embraced the vast, invisible army of commensal bacteria, allowing their skin and their powerful, intensely acidic digestive tracts to act as a natural, rugged fortress against disease. They allowed their bare feet to adapt, grow calloused, and thrive in the dirt, rather than trapping them in suffocating, disease-breeding modern shoes. As we sit here today in our heavily air-conditioned, hermetically sealed, heavily sterilized modern homes, suffering from skyrocketing rates of autoimmune diseases, crippling modern allergies, and widespread inflammatory conditions, evolutionary biologists are seriously beginning to wonder if we have gone entirely too far. The old friends hypothesis suggests that by completely eradicating our exposure to the natural dirt, the soil, and the harmless, diverse bacteria of the wild, we have left our powerful immune systems bored, uncalibrated, and prone to attacking our own bodies. We are arguably too clean. Perhaps the ultimate lesson we can learn from the story of ancient hygiene is a lesson in deep, foundational respect. The next time you walk through a dense, muddy forest, smell the sharp, acrid tang of a smoky campfire clinging to your clothes, or feel the rough, unyielding texture of tree bark beneath your bare hands, do not view it as dirt to be frantically scrubbed away. View it as an intimate, ancient connection to the environment that built you. It is the very environment that tested, challenged, and ultimately forged the brilliant, enduring, deeply resilient biology of the human race. Our Stone Age ancestors survived the absolute harshest, most unforgiving climates the Earth has ever produced. They outlasted the massive glaciers, outsmarted the apex predators, and conquered the globe. They did not do this by being ignorant, dirty beasts. They did it by being incredibly intelligent, endlessly resourceful, and deeply, naturally clean.